Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean, your guide through shadows and secrets. Here, every teacup trembles with hidden truths, and every smile may mask a crime. Settle in. The mystery is about to unfold. In the quaint village of St. Mary's Mead, a dream wedding turns into a nightmare when the beautiful bride, Clara Beaumont, vanishes moments before her vows. Her gown left crumpled, her veil torn and abandoned by the rushing river. Was it a tragic accident, a desperate escape, or something far more sinister? Enter Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind who spots the clues everyone misses. A brooding ex-fiancé lurking in the shadows, a jealous sister with hidden motives, and a trail of planted evidence leading straight to betrayal. As suspicions swirl and secrets unravel, Miss Marple digs deep into twisted family loyalties, uncovering a plot of abduction and deception that could destroy lives forever. But in this gripping tale of love, envy, and redemption, the truth is closer to home than anyone dares imagine. Will the bride return? Who's the real villain? Dive into The Vanishing Bride, a mystery that'll keep you guessing till the shocking end. Chapter 1. The Wedding That Never Was. The sun cast a golden hue over the sleepy village of St. Mary's Mead on that fateful June morning, where the chime of church bells mingled with the chatter of excited villagers. Weddings were rare spectacles in such a quiet corner of England, and the union of Miss Clara Beaumont and Mr. Edward Langley promised to be the event of the season. The Langley family, with their ancient lineage and modest fortune, held sway over the local gentry, their manor house standing sentinel at the edge of the village like a benevolent guardian. Clara Beaumont, a newcomer from the bustling streets of London, had swept into Edward's life like a fresh spring breeze. With her porcelain skin, cascading auburn curls, and eyes that sparkled with quiet intelligence, she embodied the ideal of feminine grace. Edward, a sturdy gentleman of 35, with a kind face framed by neatly trimmed whiskers, had inherited the estate after his father's untimely passing. His proposal to Clara, after a whirlwind courtship, had set tongues wagging, some in approval, others in envy. The Church of St. Mary's, a venerable stone edifice dating back to the Norman conquest, was transformed into a floral paradise. Garlands of white roses and lilacs draped the ancient arches, their scent heavy in the warm air. Guests arrived in a procession of carriages and motor cars, the women in pastel frocks and elaborate hats, the men in mourning suits, all eager to witness the nuptials. Among them sat Miss Jane Marple, an elderly spinster known for her unassuming presence and razor-sharp wit. She had taken her customary seat at the rear, her frail figure bundled in a sensible woolen shawl. Despite the summer warmth, a basket of knitting at her feet. From her vantage point, Miss Marple surveyed the assembly with the practised eye of one who had unravelled many a village intrigue. There was Mrs. Langley, Edward's mother, resplendent in lavender silk, her face beaming with maternal pride as she greeted latecomers. Edward himself paced the chancel steps, his hands clasped behind his back, a faint sheen of perspiration on his brow, nerves perhaps, or something more. And then there was Beatrice Langley, Edward's sister, a plain woman in her late 20s, her features sharp and her demeanour reserved. She lingered near the altar, adjusting a vase of flowers with unnecessary vigour, her gaze flicking toward the entrance with an intensity that Miss Marple found intriguing. The organist, Old Mr. Hargreaves struck up the bridal march with flourish, the notes swelling through the nave. Heads turned in unison, craning for a glimpse of the bride. The double doors at the church's rear stood ajar, admitting a shaft of sunlight, but no figure emerged. Seconds stretched into minutes, the music faltering as the organist glanced uncertainly at the vicar. A low hum of confusion rose from the pews, whispers of delay, perhaps a last-minute adjustment to her gown. The vicar, Reverend Clements, a rotund man with a kindly disposition, cleared his throat and dispatched young Tommy Pierce, the altar boy, to inquire at the bride's preparation room in the vestry. The boy scampered off, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the hushed sanctuary. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her knitting needles, her mind already weaving patterns from the threads of anomaly. Tommy returned moments later, his face ashen, bursting through the side door with wide eyes. "She's not there, sir, Miss Beaumont. Her room's empty. The dress is on the floor, all crumpled like, and no sign of her anywhere." A gasp rippled through the congregation, chairs scraping as people rose in alarm. Edward froze, his colour draining, while Mrs. Langley clutched her pearls, her pride dissolving into dismay. Beatrice stepped forward, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "There must be a mistake." Clara wouldn't just vanish. Miss Marple remained seated, her expression serene amid the chaos. She adjusted her spectacles, peering at the faces around her, the shock on Edward's, the flicker of something unreadable in Beatrice's eyes. "How very extraordinary," she murmured to herself, setting aside her wool. In the quiet depths of her mind, the first suspicions began to stir, like shadows lengthening at dusk. This was no mere bridal jitters. Something darker lurked beneath the veneer of village bliss. Chapter 2. The Torn Veil. The sun, which had risen so cheerfully over St. Mary's Mead that morning, seemed to falter as the afternoon wore on, casting long, uneasy shadows across the village. The aborted wedding of Clara Beaumont and Edward Langley had set every tongue wagging, and the once festive air of the Langley estate now carried the weight of whispered speculation. The church, so recently adorned with roses, stood silent, its doors locked, as if to guard the mystery within. By noon, the news of Clara's disappearance had spread like wildfire, igniting curiosity and dread in equal measure. Miss Jane Marple, ever the unobtrusive observer, had declined to join the frantic search parties that fanned out across the estate and beyond. Instead, she sat in the vicarage parlour, invited by the distressed Mrs. Langley for a consoling cup of tea. The room was a study in faded elegance, chintz curtains, a worn Persian rug, and a silver tea service that gleamed despite its age. Mrs. Langley, her lavender silk now crumpled, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her voice tremulous as she recounted the morning's events to the small gathering of confidants. "It's unthinkable," she said, her words punctuated by a stifled sob. "Clara was so happy, so radiant, why would she leave? And her dress, left on the floor like that. It's not like her at all." Her eyes darted to the vicar, Reverend Clements, who nodded sympathetically, though his own face betrayed uncertainty. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair, sipped her tea with deliberate calm, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clements, bustled about, offering scones no one touched. Beatrice Langley, Edward's sister, perched on the edge of a settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her plain face, usually composed, bore a strained expression, and her fingers twitched as if resisting some unspoken urge. Miss Marple noted this, her mind cataloguing the subtle cues as she might the stitches in her knitting. Perhaps, ventured Reverend Clements, clearing his throat, Miss Beaumont had a change of heart. Young ladies can be impulsive, you know. The pressure of such an occasion— "Nonsense!" Mrs. Langley snapped, her grief giving way to indignation. "Clara adored Edward. She told me so herself only yesterday. No, something dreadful has happened, I'm sure of it." Beatrice stirred, her voice low but firm. "We mustn't jump to conclusions, Mother." Clara might have gone for a walk, perhaps to clear her head. She was nervous this morning, wasn't she? I saw her pacing in the vestry. Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, though her eyes remained fixed on Beatrice. "Nervous, you say?" "How interesting. Did she mention anything troubling her, Miss Langley?" Beatrice's gaze flickered to the window, avoiding Miss Marple's steady scrutiny. "Not in so many words, just bridal nerves, I suppose." She was fidgeting with her veil, muttering about it being too heavy. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion at the door. Constable Barnes, a stout man with a walrus moustache, entered, his face flushed from exertion. In his hand he held a delicate object, mud-streaked and tattered. Clara's wedding veil. The high room fell silent, the air thick with apprehension. "Found by the riverbank, ma'am," he said, addressing Mrs. Langley. "Young Tommy Pierce spotted it caught in the brambles near the old mill. Torn, as you see, and caked with mud. No sign of Miss Beaumont, though we're still searching." Mrs. Langley let out a strangled cry, her hand flying to her mouth. Beatrice rose abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "The river," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't think she—" "No, no," Constable Barnes said quickly, though his tone lacked conviction. "Could be she dropped it, or it was carried there by the wind. We've got men combing the banks and the woods beyond. We'll find her." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but commanding attention. "May I see the veil, Constable?" He hesitated, then handed it to her, his large hands clumsy with the delicate fabric. She examined it closely, her fingers tracing the jagged tears. The lace, once pristine, was ripped in several places, the edges frayed, but not frayed enough to suggest natural wear. "These tears," she murmured, almost to herself, "are not the work of brambles alone. They're too clean, too deliberate." The constable frowned, unaccustomed to such scrutiny from an elderly spinster. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Only that we must consider all possibilities," she replied, her tone mild, but her eyes keen. "This veil was placed by the river, I think, to tell a story. But is it the true story, or one meant to mislead?" The room grew quiet, the weight of her words settling over the group. Mrs. Langley's sobs resumed, softer now, while Beatrice stared at the floor, her knuckles white. Reverend Clements, sensing the need for action, suggested organising more search parties, and the constable agreed, bustling out to rally the volunteers. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, her mind turning over the puzzle like a well-worn quilt. As the afternoon waned, she excused herself, claiming a need for fresh air. With her umbrella in hand, she made her way to the riverbank, a narrow path winding through reeds and willows. The old mill, its wheel long stilled, loomed in the distance, its shadow stretching across the water. The spot where the veil was found was marked by a cluster of villagers, Their voices hushed as they pointed to the brambles. Miss Marple approached slowly, her eyes scanning the ground. The mud was soft here, churned by recent rains, and she noted several footprints, some heavy, likely the constable's, but others lighter, less distinct. A woman's, perhaps, or a man's, treading carefully. She knelt, her arthritis protesting, and examined the brambles. A few threads of lace still clung to the thorns, but the surrounding area was curiously undisturbed. No broken branches, no signs of a struggle. Most peculiar, she said aloud, her voice lost in the rustle of the river. If Clara was here, she left no trace. And if she wasn't, why the veil? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint rustle in the undergrowth. She turned, her umbrella raised like a sceptre, but the bushes were still, save for the flutter of a startled bird. Yet Miss Marple's instincts, honed by years of quiet observation, told her she was not alone. Someone had been watching, someone who preferred to remain unseen. Returning to the village, she stopped at the Blue Boar Inn, where the local gossip flowed as freely as the ale. The innkeeper, Mrs. Hawkins, was a font of information, her plump hands busy polishing glasses as she recounted the latest theories. Some say Clara ran off with another man, she confided, leaning over the counter. Others reckon she fell in the river, poor thing. But me, I think there's more to it. That Langley girl, Beatrice, she's always been odd, hasn't she? Clinging to her brother like he's her lifeline. Miss Marple nodded, encouraging the flow of words. And what of strangers in the village? Anyone knew about? Mrs. Hawkins's eyes lit up. Now you mention it, there was a fellow here last night. Tall, dark city type. Didn't give his name, but he asked after the Langley place. Seemed mighty interested in the wedding. This piqued Miss Marple's interest. Did he now? And where did he go after? Left at dawn, or so my barman says. Took the early train to London, maybe. But he was skulking about. No mistake, Miss Marple thanked her, and stepped into the evening air, her mind alight with possibilities. A stranger, the torn veil, Beatrice's unease, each was a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven. She recalled a similar incident in her youth, when a girl in St. Mary's Mead had vanished, only to be found hiding in a neighbour's attic, fleeing an overbearing suitor. But this felt different, more calculated. The veil was a clue, but not to Clara's fate, rather to someone's intent. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a lamp and settled into her armchair, her knitting untouched. She closed her eyes, letting the pieces of the puzzle drift before her. Beatrice's nervous hands, the deliberate tears in the veil, the mysterious stranger, they formed a pattern, though its shape was still unclear. People are so predictable, she mused, and yet so surprising. Like my nephew's dreadful modern novels, full of twists, but the heart of the story is always human nature. As the clock struck 9, a knock came at her door. It was Tommy Pierce, breathless and wide-eyed. "Miss Marple, you'll want to hear this." They've found something else by the river. A brooch, silver, with a C on it. Clara's, they're saying. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Indeed? And where exactly was it found? Near the vale, but further up, by the old willow. Constable's got it now, says it's proof she was there. Proof? Miss Marple echoed, her tone, thoughtful. Or another piece of the story someone wants us to believe. She thanked Tommy and sent him off with a peppermint, her mind already racing. The brooch, like the veil, was too convenient, too carefully placed. Someone was orchestrating this mystery, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the hand behind the curtain. Chapter 3. The Shadow of a Former Love. The morning after Clara Beaumont's disappearance dawned with a heavy mist that clung to the fields of St. Mary's Mead, lending the village an air of secrecy. The Langley estate, once aglow with wedding preparations, now stood sombre, its windows like watchful eyes peering through the fog. The discovery of Clara's torn veil by the riverbank, followed by the silver brooch engraved with a delicate C, had deepened the mystery, stirring a tempest of speculation among the villagers. Was Clara swept away by the river's treacherous current? Had she fled, overcome by doubts? Or was there a darker hand at play, orchestrating her absence? Miss Jane Marple, seated at her cottage breakfast table with a pot of Earl Grey and a slice of toast, pondered these questions as she reviewed the morning's post. Her nimble fingers sorted through letters, but her mind was elsewhere, weaving the threads of the previous day's discoveries. The veil, with its deliberate tears, and the brooch, so conveniently placed, suggested a narrative crafted to mislead. Someone, she murmured to her tabby cat Tuppence, is telling a story, but it is not Clara's. Tuppence blinked, unimpressed, and Miss Marple smiled faintly, accustomed to her feline companion's indifference. Her reverie was broken by a sharp rap at the door. It was Mrs. Hawkins, the innkeeper from the Blue Boar, her round face flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple, you'll never guess who's turned up," she exclaimed, barely pausing for breath. "A gentleman from London says he's Clara's old beau. Roland Hayes, his name is. He's at the inn now, demanding to know what's happened to her. Says he feared for her safety and came straight away." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. "How very timely," she said, her tone as mild as ever. "And what sort of man is this Mr. Hayes?" "Tall, dark, a bit brooding if you ask me," Mrs. Hawkins replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Handsome enough, but there's a fire in him." He was asking all sorts of questions about the Langleys, Edward especially. Didn't seem pleased to hear about the wedding. "Thank you, Mrs. Hawkins," Miss Marple said, rising with a grace that belied her years. "I believe I shall take a stroll to the inn. The air will do me good, and perhaps Mr. Hayes will shed light on our little puzzle." The Blue Boar Inn was a hub of activity, its low-beamed ceilings echoing with the hum of voices. Villagers clustered at tables, their conversations a tangle of theories about Clara's fate. Miss Marple slipped inside, her presence barely noticed amid the clamour. She spotted Roland Hayes at once, a striking figure in a tailored overcoat, his dark hair slightly dishevelled, his jaws set with determination. He stood at the bar, engaged in a heated exchange with Edward Langley, who had evidently come to confront the newcomer. "She never loved you, Langley," Roland was saying, his voice low but laced with venom. "Clara was mine first, and you stole her with your promises and your estate. If she's gone, I'll wager you had a hand in it." Edward's face reddened, his hands clenching at his sides. "That's a lie, Hayes. Clara chose me freely. If anyone's to blame, it's you, showing up now, stirring trouble when she's missing." Miss Marple, settling into a corner table with a view of the scene, ordered a pot of tea and observed the confrontation with keen interest. Roland's passion was palpable, but there was a theatrical quality to his accusations, as if he were playing a part. Edward, meanwhile, seemed genuinely shaken, his usual composure frayed. The exchange ended abruptly when Roland stormed out, leaving Edward to slump against the bar, his head in his hands. Approaching Edward with her characteristic gentleness, Miss Marple offered a sympathetic smile. "A trying day, Mr. Langley." "This Mr. Hayes seems most distressed. Did you know him before today?" Edward looked up, his eyes weary. "Only by name. Clara mentioned him once or twice. An old engagement, broken off years ago. She said it was her choice, that he was too possessive. I never thought he'd come here." Miss Marple nodded, filing away this detail. "And yet he has, and at such a moment. Curious, don't you think?" She patted his arm and returned to her tea, her mind turning over the new piece of the puzzle. Determined to learn more, Miss Marple sought out Clara's maid, Elsie, who lived in a tidy cottage near the Langley estate. Elsie, a nervous girl with mousy hair and darting eyes, was polishing silver when Miss Marple arrived, her knock soft but insistent. After a moment's hesitation, Elsie invited her in, offering a cup of weak tea and a seat by the fire. "Elsie, my dear," Miss Marple began, her voice soothing, "you were with Miss Beaumont on the morning of the wedding. Did she seem herself? Any hint of what might have prompted her to leave?" Elsie fidgeted, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. "She was quiet, ma'am, quieter than usual. Kept looking at the door, like she expected someone. I thought it was just nerves, but then there was the letter." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "A letter? Yes, ma'am. It came a few days before the wedding from London. I didn't see who wrote it, but Miss Clara read it and went pale. She burned it in the fireplace, said it was nothing, but she was jumpy after. Kept saying she loved Mr. Edward and wouldn't change her mind no matter what." "And did she mention Mr. Hayes?" Miss Marple pressed, her tone gentle but probing. Elsie nodded reluctantly. "She said he'd written, begging her to come back to him. She laughed it off, but I could tell it troubled her. She was glancing over her shoulder all week, like she thought someone was watching." Miss Marple thanked Elsie and left, her mind buzzing. A letter from Roland, burned to hide its contents, and Clara's unease in the days before her disappearance. These were no mere coincidences. She recalled a case from years ago in St. Mary's Mead, where a young man's desperate letters had driven a girl to flee her home, only to be found safe with a cousin. But Clara's situation felt more sinister, the stakes higher. As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the churchyard, where a small crowd had gathered. Constable Barnes was there, holding court with a mix of authority and unease. He had found another clue, he announced, a silk ribbon, pale blue, caught in the hedge near the river path. "It matches the sash on Miss Beaumont's wedding dress," he said, holding it aloft. "She was here, mark my words." The villagers murmured, some crossing themselves, others whispering of drowning or flight. Miss Marple, however, approached the constable and examined the ribbon closely. It was pristine, save for a single snag, and bore no trace of mud or water. "Most interesting," she said softly. "And where exactly was this found, Constable?" "Just beyond the brambles, near the willow," he replied, pointing down the path. "Same place as the brooch, more or less." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The ribbon, like the veil and brooch, was too perfectly placed, too free of the river's grime. She thanked the constable and made her way to the spot, her umbrella tapping the ground like a metronome. The hedge was dense, its branches tangled, but the ribbon had been caught at eye level, easily visible to a passer-by. Not dropped in a struggle, she mused, but placed to be found. Her inspection was interrupted by a figure emerging from the mist, Beatrice Langley. Her face pale, and her coat buttoned tightly despite the mild weather. She froze upon seeing Miss Marple, her eyes darting to the hedge. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice strained. "I was just walking." Trying to clear my head. "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but her gaze sharp. "It's a troubling time. Have you any thoughts on this ribbon? It seems to belong to Clara's dress." Beatrice's hands clenched at her sides. "I wouldn't know. I wasn't near the river yesterday. I was in the church, helping with the flowers." Her words came too quickly, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in her voice. "Quite so," Miss Marple said, smiling. "You were most helpful, I'm sure." "Such a pity about the wedding. Clara seemed so fond of your brother Beatrice's lips." Tightened. "She was. Edward deserves someone who truly loves him." With that, she hurried away, her footsteps muffled by the damp grass. Miss Marple lingered, her mind turning over Beatrice's words. The girl's devotion to her brother was evident, but there was an edge to it, a possessiveness that struck a chord. She recalled a neighbor from her youth, a woman who had sabotaged her brother's engagement out of fear of losing his affection. Could Beatrice be capable of such an act? And what of Roland Hayes, with his timely arrival and fiery accusations? Determined to learn more, Miss Marple returned to the Blue Boar, where Roland had taken a room. She found him in the private parlour, staring into a glass of whisky, his face etched with worry. He rose as she entered, surprised by the visit from this unassuming old lady. "Mr. Hayes," Miss Marple began, settling into a chair, "I understand you were close to Miss Beaumont." Her disappearance must be a great shock. Roland's jaw tightened. "It is. I loved her, Miss Marple. When I heard she was marrying Langley, I couldn't believe it. She was happy with me, or so I thought. I came to see her, to make sure she was certain." "And did you see her?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but her eyes piercing. He hesitated, his fingers drumming on the table. "No. I arrived the night before the wedding, but it was late. I walked by the estate, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, but the place was dark. I went to the river instead to think. That's when I heard about the veil." Miss Marple tilted her head. "The river. A curious place to reflect. So late at night, Roland flushed. I needed air. London's stifling, and this village, it's too quiet. I couldn't sleep." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "And the letter you sent Clara. Did it change her mind?" His eyes widened, then narrowed. "How did you—" "Yes, I wrote to her. I begged her to reconsider, to meet me. She never replied. I thought maybe she'd changed her mind about Langley." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind alight with new connections. Roland's presence at the river, his letter, Beatrice's unease, they formed a constellation of motives, each pointing to a different truth. She recalled a case in St. Mary's Mead, where a spurned lover had staged a disappearance to win back his beloved, only to find she had never left. But Clara's absence felt more deliberate, the clues too carefully arranged. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. The ribbon, the brooch, the veil, all pointed to the river, yet none bore the marks of a struggle, or the river's touch. Roland's story was plausible but incomplete, and Beatrice's behaviour suggested a deeper involvement. "Someone is playing a game," Miss Marple said to Tuppence, who yawned in response. "But games have rules, and rules can be broken." The mystery deepened, and Miss Marple knew the next clue would be crucial. As the village settled into an uneasy night, she resolved to watch closely, certain that the shadow of a former love, or a hidden jealousy, was at the heart of Clara's vanishing. Chapter 4. The Cellar's Secret. The mist that had cloaked St. Mary's Mead the previous day had lifted by the third morning of Clara Beaumont's disappearance, replaced by a crisp sunlight that did little to dispel the village's unease. The Langley estate, with its gabled roofs and ivy-draped walls, stood as a silent sentinel, its grandeur now tinged with an air of foreboding. The discovery of Clara's torn veil, her silver brooch, and the blue silk ribbon by the river had fueled a torrent of theories. Drowning, flight, even foul play. But no trace of the bride herself had emerged. The villagers, their initial shock giving way to restless curiosity, gathered in knots at the post office and the Blue Boar Inn, dissecting every detail with the fervour of amateur sleuths. Miss Jane Marple, however, preferred the quiet of her cottage, where she could sift through the puzzle's pieces undisturbed. Over a breakfast of poached eggs and tea, she reflected on the clues: the veil's deliberate tears, the pristine ribbon, Roland Hayes's timely arrival, and Beatrice Langley's nervous demeanour. Each suggested a carefully staged narrative, but to what end? "It's like a play," she murmured to her cat Tuppence, who flicked her tail in response. "The props are all in place, but the script is hidden." Her thoughts kept returning to the Langley estate itself, its sprawling grounds and ancient rooms harbouring secrets as old as its stones. The estate's cellars, in particular, intrigued her. She recalled a conversation with Mrs. Langley years ago, when the family had hosted a charity bazaar. The cellars, vast and labyrinthine, were used for storing wine and preserves, their damp corridors rarely visited. "A perfect place to hide something or someone," Miss Marple mused, her knitting needles clicking softly as she considered her next move. The new padlock on the cellar door, glimpsed during a recent visit, had struck her as odd. Too shiny, too modern for a house steeped in tradition. Beatrice's quick dismissal of it only deepened her suspicion. Determined to explore this thread, Miss Marple donned her tweed coat and set out for the Langley estate, her umbrella serving as both cane and shield against the morning chill. The village was abuzz as she passed, with children whispering about ghosts and old men speculating over pints. She paused at the churchyard, where Constable Barnes was addressing a small crowd, his walrus moustache twitching with authority. "We're widening the search to the woods beyond the river," he announced, holding up a map. "If Miss Beaumont's out there, we'll find her." Miss Marple nodded politely but kept her own counsel. The river, with its trio of clues, felt like a distraction, a painted backdrop to divert attention from the true stage. She continued to the estate, where she found Mrs. Langley in the drawing-room, her face drawn with worry. Edward paced by the fireplace, his usual composure frayed, while Beatrice sat stitching a sampler, her needle moving with mechanical precision. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," Mrs. Langley said, her voice brittle. "We're at our wits' end. The constable says they've found nothing new, and Edward, oh, he's beside himself." Edward paused, his hands clenching. "I should have checked on her myself that morning." "If I'd gone to the vestry sooner." "Nonsense, dear," Miss Marple said gently, settling into a chair. "You couldn't have known." "But perhaps a tour of the house might lift your spirits." I've always admired its architecture, and a walk might do us all good." Mrs. Langley hesitated, but Beatrice rose quickly. "I'll show you, Miss Marple." "The house is old, but there's not much to see." Her tone was brisk, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. As they moved through the manor's halls, Miss Marple kept up a stream of innocuous chatter, commenting on the oak panelling and the portraits of stern-faced Langleys. Beatrice's responses were curt, her steps hurried, as if eager to end the tour. When they reached the kitchen corridor, Miss Marple paused by the cellar door, its heavy iron frame secured by a gleaming padlock. "Oh my," she said, feigning surprise. "Such a modern lock for an old house." "Is it new?" Beatrice's fingers twitched. "Yes, quite new. We had trouble with vagrants last winter, so Edward thought it best. It's just storage down there, nothing interesting." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her smile bland but her mind alert. "Still, old cellars have such charm." "I remember one in my childhood home, full of cobwebs and forgotten treasures." "Might we take a peek?" Beatrice's face tightened. "It's locked, and I haven't the key." "Edward keeps it. Besides, it's damp and dusty, hardly worth your time." Miss Marple nodded, as if satisfied, but her suspicion deepened. Beatrice's haste to dismiss the cellar was telling, like a dropped stitch in an otherwise perfect pattern. She thanked her guide and returned to the drawing-room, where she engaged Mrs. Langley in talk of village affairs, all the while plotting her next move. That evening, Miss Marple enlisted the help of Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, whose sharp eyes and penchant for adventure made him an ideal ally. Over a glass of lemonade in her garden, she gave him careful instructions. "Tommy, I need you to keep watch near the Langley estate tonight. Stay out of sight, near the kitchen yard. If anyone enters the cellar, note the time and what they carry. Can you do that?" Tommy's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Like a real detective, Miss Marple. You can count on me." He scampered off, promising to report back before midnight. As the village clock struck 10, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched. The Langley estate, with its secrets locked behind that shiny padlock, loomed large in her thoughts. She recalled a case from years ago, when a missing girl in St. Mary's Mead had been found locked in a shed, hidden by a jealous rival. The cellar felt like a similar hiding place, but for what, or whom? At 11:30, Tommy returned, breathless and triumphant. "Miss Marple, I saw her!" Miss Beatrice, sneaking into the cellar just after 11. She had a tray, bread, cheese, a jug of water. Looked like she was feeding someone. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Well done, Tommy. Did she see you? Not a chance." I hid behind the coal shed, quiet as a mouse. She pressed a shilling into his hand and sent him home, her mind racing. A tray of food suggested a living prisoner, not a corpse. Could Clara be in the cellar, hidden away? And if so, why? Beatrice's devotion to her brother was fierce, but was it fierce enough to drive her to such lengths? The next morning, Miss Marple paid a call on the vicar, Reverend Clements, whose good nature made him a useful ally. Over tea in the vicarage, she shared her suspicions, careful to frame them as idle thoughts. "The cellar at the Langley estate," she said, stirring her tea, "seems an odd place to lock so securely. I wonder if it's been searched." The vicar frowned. "The cellar? Surely not. The constable's men have scoured the grounds, the river, the woods. But a cellar, that's a private matter, isn't it?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But in my experience, Private places hide the most secrets. Might you speak to Constable Barnes? A discreet look could do no harm. Reverend Clements, accustomed to Miss Marple's knack for uncovering truths, agreed to pass along her suggestion. By afternoon, the constable, though sceptical, had obtained Edward's permission to inspect the cellar. Miss Marple, invited along as a courtesy, accompanied the small party, Constable Barnes, Edward, and the vicar, to the estate. Beatrice was nowhere to be seen, a fact Miss Marple noted with interest. Edward produced a key, his hands trembling as he unlocked the padlock. "I don't know why we're bothering," he muttered. "It's just old wine and apples down there." The cellar door creaked open, revealing a stone staircase descending into darkness. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of earth and mildew. Constable Barnes led the way, his lantern casting flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls. The cellar was a maze of low corridors, lined with barrels and crates, their contents shrouded in dust. Miss Marple followed slowly, her umbrella tapping the floor, her eyes scanning every corner. At the far end of the main passage, they found a smaller door, its wood newer than the rest. It too was locked, but Edward's key did not fit. "That's odd," he said, frowning. "I didn't know this was locked separately." Constable Barnes, his suspicion now roused, called for a crowbar. The door gave way with a splintering crack, revealing a small chamber, barely 10 feet square. Inside, on a narrow cot, sat Clara Beaumont, pale but alive, her auburn hair tangled and her eyes wide with fear. A tray of half-eaten bread and cheese sat on a crate beside her, a jug of water nearby. "Clara!" Edward cried, rushing to her side. She flinched at first, then clung to him, tears streaming down her face. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice calm. "Miss Beaumont, can you tell us what happened?" Clara's voice was hoarse, her words halting. It was Beatrice. "On the morning of the wedding, she came to the vestry, said she needed to show me something urgent in the cellar. I followed her, thinking it was about Edward. She locked me in here, said she couldn't let me marry him. I begged, but she wouldn't listen." Constable Barnes's face darkened. "Beatrice Langley, eh? Where is she now?" Edward, still holding Clara, looked stricken. "She said she was visiting a friend in Uppermead this morning." I had no idea Miss Marple's mind was already piecing together the motive. Beatrice's devotion to her brother, her fear of losing him to Clara, had driven her to desperate measures. The veil, the brooch, the ribbon, all were her attempts to create a story of flight or tragedy, diverting suspicion from her own actions. As Clara was helped upstairs, wrapped in a blanket, Miss Marple lingered in the cellar, her eyes lingering on the tray. The food was fresh, the jug refilled recently. Beatrice had been caring for her prisoner, perhaps torn between guilt and resolve. "Jealousy is a cruel master," Miss Marple murmured, her thoughts drifting to a long-ago village scandal, where a sister's envy had led to a similar betrayal. The group returned to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Langley, summoned from her room, wept with relief at Clara's return. But the mystery was not fully resolved. Beatrice's absence suggested she knew her secret was at risk, and Roland Hayes's role remained unclear. Had he known of Clara's captivity, or was his arrival a coincidence? Miss Marple, standing by the window, gazed out at the estate's gardens, their orderly rows a stark contrast to the chaos within. "We have found Clara," she said softly, "but the heart of this matter lies deeper." Beatrice acted alone, perhaps, but there are shadows yet to be uncovered. The constable sent men to find Beatrice, while Edward and Clara sat together, their hands clasped. Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew the next hours would reveal more. About Beatrice, about Roland, and about the tangled emotions that had turned a joyous wedding into a dark enigma. Chapter 5. The Jealous Sister. The discovery of Clara Beaumont in the damp, shadowed cellar of the Langley estate sent ripples of shock through St. Mary's Mead, transforming the village's anxious whispers into a crescendo of astonishment. By midday, the news had spread from the post office to the Blue Boar Inn, where villagers gathered, their faces a mixture of relief and morbid curiosity. Clara, pale but unharmed, had been whisked to the vicarage for rest and a doctor's attention, while the Langley household reeled under the weight of Beatrice's betrayal. The torn veil, the silver brooch, and the blue ribbon, once ominous portents of tragedy, now stood revealed as pieces of a cruel deception orchestrated by Edward Langley's sister. Yet for Miss Jane Marple, knitting quietly in her cottage that afternoon, the puzzle was far from complete. The threads of motive and opportunity were tangled, and she sensed that the truth, like a half-finished tapestry, still held hidden patterns. The sun hung low, casting golden streaks across the village green, as Miss Marple made her way to the Langley estate. She had been invited to a gathering organised by Reverend Clements, ostensibly to discuss Clara's safe return and the ongoing search for Beatrice, who had not been seen since her morning departure for Upper Mead. Miss Marple, however, suspected the visit to a friend was a pretext, and her sharp mind was already tracing the contours of Beatrice's actions. The cellar's secret had been uncovered, but why had Beatrice acted so drastically? And what role, if any, did Roland Hayes, Clara's brooding former fiancé, play in the drama? The Langley drawing-room was a scene of strained civility when Miss Marple arrived. Mrs. Langley, her lavender silk replaced by a sombre grey dress, sat rigid on a velvet sofa, her eyes red-rimmed but her chin held high. Edward stood by the window, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. Relief at Clara's return warring with anguish over his sister's actions. Clara herself, wrapped in a shawl and seated near the fire, looked fragile but resolute. Her auburn hair pinned loosely, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Roland Hayes was there too, an unexpected presence, his dark eyes fixed on Clara with a mixture of concern and defiance. The vicar and Constable Barnes completed the group, the former offering gentle platitudes, the latter scribbling notes with a furrowed brow. Miss Marple settled into a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and observed the room with her customary unobtrusiveness. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and she noted the way Roland's gaze lingered on Clara, the way Edward avoided his sister's empty chair, and the way Mrs. Langley's fingers twisted her handkerchief into knots. "A most distressing affair," Miss Marple said softly, breaking the silence, "but we are all grateful for Miss Beaumont's safety. Perhaps, Clara, you could tell us more about what happened. Every detail helps. You know, Clara's voice was steady but faint, as if recounting the ordeal drained her anew. It was so sudden," she began, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Beatrice came to the vestry just before the ceremony. She said there was something in the cellar I needed to see, something about Edward, a surprise for the wedding. I trusted her. She's his sister, after all. But when we reached that little room, she pushed me inside and locked the door. I heard the bolt slide, and then nothing. She came back with food, water, but she wouldn't speak, wouldn't explain. Only said I couldn't marry Edward, that it wasn't right. Edward's head snapped up, his voice hoarse. Beatrice said that. Why? She never objected to you before, never once. Clara hesitated, glancing at Roland, who shifted uncomfortably. I think she was afraid of losing you, Edward. She spoke of the family, how it was just the two of you after your mother's illness began. She said I'd take you away, change everything. Mrs. Langley let out a stifled sob. My poor Beatrice. She's always been so devoted to Edward, ever since he took over the estate. But to do this, locking Clara away like some criminal, it's unthinkable. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the tension. Devotion can be a powerful force, she said, her tone mild but her eyes sharp. It can blind one to reason, turn love into something quite dangerous. But I wonder, Miss Beaumont, did Beatrice mention anyone else? Any reason she felt so threatened? Clara shook her head. No, only that she couldn't let the marriage happen. She was frantic, almost wild. I was frightened, but she didn't hurt me. She just left me there, in the dark. Roland, who had been silent, leaned forward, his voice low and intense. This is madness. Clara, if I'd known, if I'd had any idea you were in danger, I'd have torn that house apart to find you. His words carried a passion that drew every eye, and Miss Marple noted the flush that crept up Clara's cheeks. Edward's jaw tightened. You've no right to speak to her like that, Hayes. You lost her years ago. This is a family matter, not your concern. Roland's eyes flashed. Family? Your sister locked Clara in a cellar. If anyone's to blame, it's you for not seeing what was under your nose. The room bristled with tension, and Reverend Clements raised a hand for peace. Gentlemen, please. We're here to understand, not to accuse. Miss Marple, have you any thoughts? You've a knack for seeing what others miss. All eyes turned to the elderly spinster, who paused her knitting and smiled faintly. I'm merely an observer, Reverend, but I do find it curious how everything points to the river. The veil, the brooch, the ribbon. They were placed so carefully, as if to tell a story of flight or tragedy. And yet Clara was here, under our very feet. It suggests a plan, a deliberate misdirection. Beatrice, I think, wanted us to look elsewhere. Constable Barnes nodded, his pencil poised. Aye, she's clever, that one. But where's she gone now? We've men searching Upper Mead, but no sign of her yet. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the garden stretched toward the woods. Miss Langley is no fool. She knew the cellar would be found eventually. I suspect she's nearby, watching, perhaps waiting for a chance to explain or escape. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. A young maid, her face pale, entered with a note for Edward. He read it quickly, his expression darkening. It's from Beatrice, he said, his voice hollow. She says she's sorry, that she never meant harm. She's at the old summer house by the lake, asks to see me alone. Clara gasped, and Mrs. Langley clutched her arm. You mustn't go, Edward. What if she's dangerous? Constable Barnes stood, his hand on his truncheon. I'll go with you, sir. No telling what she's planning. Miss Marple, however, raised a hand. Might I suggest, Constable, that we all go? Beatrice may be more forthcoming if she feels understood, not cornered. And I, for one, would like to hear her story. Reluctantly, the group agreed, and they set out across the estate's grounds. a strange procession led by Edward's determined stride. The summer house, a quaint wooden structure overgrown with roses, stood by a small lake, its reflection shimmering in the still water. As they approached, Beatrice emerged from the doorway, her plain face gaunt, her eyes red from crying. She froze at the sight of the group, her hands twisting together. "Edward," she whispered, ignoring the others, "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted to protect you." Edward's voice was raw. "Protect me?" "By locking Clara in the cellar. Beatrice, how could you?" Beatrice's composure crumbled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You don't understand. She was going to take you away, change everything. The estate, our home, it's all we have left of father, of our family. I couldn't let her ruin it." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Miss Langley, you placed the veil and the other items by the river, didn't you? To make us think Clara had fled or drowned?" Beatrice nodded, her shoulders sagging. "I tore the veil, took the brooch from her room, the ribbon from her dress. I thought if everyone believed she was gone, the wedding would be cancelled, and Edward would stay with me. I didn't hurt her, I swear. I brought her food, kept her safe." Clara, trembling, spoke up. "Safe? You locked me in the dark, Beatrice. I thought I'd never see Edward again." Beatrice flinched, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Clara. I was wrong, but I was so afraid. Edward's all I have. When Mother got ill, he was the one who kept us together. I couldn't lose him." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind remained sharp. "Fear can drive us to terrible things, my dear. But I wonder, did anyone else know of your plan? Mr. Hayes, perhaps?" Beatrice's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "Roland! No, he had nothing to do with it. I acted alone. Roland, who had been silent, stepped forward, his face pale. She's telling the truth. I came to the village to see Clara. Yes, but I didn't know about the cellar. I thought she'd run away when I heard about the veil." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze lingering on Roland. His denial was swift, but there was a tension in his posture, a flicker in his eyes that suggested more. She recalled a case from her youth, where a spurned lover had unwittingly aided a crime by stirring unrest. Roland's presence at the river, his letter to Clara, were they mere coincidence, or part of a larger design? Constable Barnes, satisfied with Beatrice's confession, took her gently by the arm. "You'll need to come with me, Miss Langley. We'll sort this out at the station." Beatrice nodded, her fight gone, and allowed herself to be led away. Edward watched, torn between anger and sorrow, while Clara clung to his arm, her relief tempered by the sting of betrayal. Mrs. Langley, weeping quietly, followed the constable, promising to stand by her daughter. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered by the summer house, her umbrella tapping the ground. The lake's surface was calm, reflecting the fading light, but her mind was anything but still. Beatrice's confession explained much, but not all. Roland's role nagged at her, like a dropped stitch in a pattern. Had he truly been ignorant, or had his actions, his letter, his nocturnal wanderings, played into Beatrice's scheme? Returning to the vicarage, Miss Marple joined Clara and Edward for tea, her presence a quiet anchor in their storm of emotions. Clara, now more composed, spoke of her ordeal with a clarity that impressed Miss Marple. "I kept thinking of Edward," she said, her hand in his. "It was what kept me strong." "But Beatrice, I never saw such desperation in her eyes." Edward shook his head. "I should have seen it." She was always so protective, so anxious when I spoke of marriage. I thought it was just sisterly love." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind elsewhere. "Love can be a powerful motive, Mr. Langley, but so can fear. Beatrice feared losing you. But I wonder if there's more to this. Mr. Hayes's arrival, for instance. It's rather convenient, don't you think?" Edward frowned. "You think he's involved?" "But Beatrice said many things," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "and I believe she acted alone in locking Clara away. But the river clues, the timing of Mr. Hayes's appearance, they suggest a shadow behind the act." Clara's eyes widened. "You mean Roland might have known?" "But why?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That, my dear, is what we must uncover. People are like knitting, simple on the surface, but the knots are often hidden underneath." As night fell, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind alight with possibilities. She sat by the fire, tuppence curled at her feet, and reviewed the day's revelations. Beatrice's jealousy had driven her to a desperate act, but Roland's presence was a loose thread, one she intended to tug. Tomorrow, she resolved, she would speak to him again, to test his story against the facts. The truth, she knew, was close, but like a shadow in the fog, it required patience to grasp. Chapter 6. The Truth Unravelled. The village of St. Mary's Mead awoke to a morning of deceptive calm, the golden light of late June spilling across its thatched roofs and cobbled lanes, as if to erase the shadows of the past few days. Clara Beaumont's rescue from the Langley estate's cellar had quelled the wildest fears of the villagers. But the revelation of Beatrice Langley's desperate act had ignited a new storm of whispers. The torn veil, the silver brooch, and the blue ribbon, once ominous harbingers of tragedy, were now understood as the props of a jealous sister's scheme to halt a wedding. Yet for Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cottage with a cup of tea and her knitting untouched, the mystery was not fully resolved. Beatrice's confession, though heartfelt, had left gaps, and the presence of Roland Hayes, Clara's former fiancé, cast a lingering shadow. Like a skein of wool with a hidden knot, the truth required careful unravelling. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Hawkins, the innkeeper from the Blue Boar, her round face alight with fresh gossip. "Miss Marple, you'll want to hear this," she said, settling into a chair without invitation. "That Mr. Hayes, he's still at the inn, pacing like a caged lion. Folks are saying he's not as innocent as he claims. Old Mr. Jenkins swears he saw him near the river the night before the wedding, long after decent folk were abed." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. "Indeed? And what was Mr. Jenkins doing by the river at such an hour?" Mrs. Hawkins chuckled. "Checking his fishing lines, or so he says. But it's queer, isn't it? Hayes claiming he just needed air. Yet there he was, skulking about where the veil was found." "Thank you, Mrs. Hawkins," Miss Marple said, her tone mild but her mind racing. "You've been most helpful." As the innkeeper bustled out, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts turning to Roland's story. His arrival in St. Mary's Mead, his letter to Clara, his nocturnal wanderings, they formed a pattern, but one that did not yet align with Beatrice's actions. Had he unwittingly aided her scheme, or was his role more deliberate? She recalled a case from her youth, where a man's seemingly innocent actions had masked a deeper intent, and resolved to test Roland's account. Determined to probe further, Miss Marple, arranged to join the Langleys for tea that afternoon, a gathering intended to mend the frayed bonds of the family. The Langley drawing room, with its heavy drapes and polished mahogany, was a stark contrast to the turmoil within. Clara, now recovered but still pale, sat beside Edward, her hand resting lightly on his. Mrs. Langley, her grief tempered by relief, poured tea with trembling hands, while Edward's face bore the weight of his sister's betrayal. Roland Hayes, invited at Clara's insistence, stood by the fireplace, his dark eyes restless. Constable Barnes and Reverend Clements were also present, the former to update the group on Beatrice's situation. She was being held at the village station, cooperative but silent, and the latter to offer spiritual comfort. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting bag, observed the group with her usual quiet intensity. The air was thick with unspoken tensions. Edward's guilt, Clara's lingering fear, Roland's brooding presence. She broke the silence with a gentle question, her voice soft but deliberate. "Mr. Hayes, you've been most concerned for Miss Beaumont's safety. I wonder, could you tell us more about your visit to the village? You arrived the night before the wedding, I believe." Roland's jaw tightened, but he met her gaze. "I came from London on a late train. I needed to see Clara, to be sure she was happy with Langley. I stayed at the Blue Boar, but I couldn't sleep. I walked by the river, yes, to clear my head. That's all." Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically. "The river, at such an hour? A curious choice. And you saw nothing unusual? No one else about?" He hesitated, his fingers drumming on the mantel. "It was dark, quiet. I heard the water, maybe an owl. Nothing else." Clara stirred, her voice tentative. "Roland, you wrote to me a few days before. You begged me to reconsider, did you? Did you come to stop the wedding?" Roland's face flushed, but he shook his head. "I wanted you to be sure, Clara. I loved you, still do, but I wouldn't force you. When I heard about the veil, I thought you'd run away, maybe because of my letter. I was wrong." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Wrong? You show up uninvited, stir up trouble, and now my sister's in custody because of your meddling." "Enough, Edward," Clara said sharply, her hand tightening on his. "Roland didn't lock me in that cellar." Beatrice did. Miss Marple's gaze flicked between them, noting Roland's discomfort and Edward's barely contained anger. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her tone deceptively mild, "you were seen near the river that night, close to where the veil was found. Can you be certain you saw nothing of it? A scrap of lace, perhaps, caught in the brambles?" Roland's eyes widened, then narrowed. "I told you, it was dark. I didn't see any veil. If it was there, it wasn't mine to notice." Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene but her mind alert. His denial was too quick, too practiced. She recalled the veil's deliberate tears, the careful placement of the brooch and ribbon. Beatrice had confessed to planting them, but Roland's presence at the river suggested a connection, however tangential. Had he stumbled upon Beatrice's work and added to it, or was he merely a convenient distraction? The conversation shifted to Beatrice, with Constable Barnes reporting that she had admitted to everything, luring Clara to the cellar, planting the clues to suggest a disappearance. "She's remorseful," he said, his moustache twitching. "Says she only wanted to protect her brother. But she's firm that no one else was involved." Mrs. Langley dabbed at her eyes. "My poor girl! She was always so devoted to Edward, ever since their father died. I should have seen her fear, her loneliness. Miss Marple's needles paused. Fear is a powerful motive, Mrs. Langley. It can twist even the kindest heart. But I wonder if we've heard the whole story. Mr. Hayes, you were at the river, and the veil was found there. Could it be you saw something you haven't shared? Roland's face darkened, and he stepped forward, his voice low. Are you accusing me, Miss Marple? I came to see Clara, yes, but I didn't touch that veil or anything else. I swear it. His vehemence drew every eye, and Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. Not accusing, Mr. Hayes, merely wondering. In my experience, people often see more than they realize. A shadow, a sound, something that might explain why the veil was torn so deliberately. Under her unwavering scrutiny, Roland's defiance faltered. He sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping. All right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I was at the river. Yes, longer than I said. I saw the veil, or something like it, caught in the brambles. I thought it was Clara's, thought she'd been there, maybe running from Langley. I was angry, hurt. I pulled at it, tore it more than it was. I didn't know what it meant, only that it felt like proof she was gone. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Roland, you tore my veil. Why didn't you say? I was ashamed, he admitted, his eyes fixed on the floor. I thought you'd left, that my letter had driven you away. I didn't know about Beatrice, I swear. When I heard you were missing, I came to help, not to cause more trouble. Edward's face was a storm of emotions, anger, betrayal, relief. You meddled, Hayes, and made things worse. That veil had us all thinking Clara was dead. Miss Marple's voice cut through the tension, calm but incisive. Mr. Hayes's actions were unwise, but they confirm Miss Langley's story. She placed the veil, and he, in his distress, added to its ruin. A coincidence, perhaps, but one that muddied the waters. Constable Barnes scribbled furiously, his brow furrowed. So you're saying Hayes didn't know about the cellar? It was all Beatrice. I believe so, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. Miss Langley acted out of fear, a desire to keep her brother close. Mr. Hayes, driven by his own passion, played a smaller part, one he scarcely understood himself. Reverend Clements, ever the peacemaker, spoke up. Then the matter is settled, surely. Beatrice will face justice, and Clara is safe. We should focus on healing now. Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. Settled, perhaps, but not quite complete. People's hearts are complex, Reverend, and their actions often ripple beyond their intent. Mr. Hayes, you returned to the village to win Clara back, did you not? Roland nodded, his face weary. I did. I thought if I could see her, talk to her, she might remember what we had. But when I saw the veil, I lost hope. I didn't know Beatrice's plan, and I didn't mean to make things worse. Clara's eyes softened, though her hand remained in Edward's. Roland, I cared for you once, but my heart is with Edward now. I wish you'd stayed away. Miss Marple watched this exchange, her mind cataloguing every nuance. Roland's confession explained the veil's condition, but it also revealed his desperation, a mirror to Beatrice's own. She recalled a village scandal years ago, where two rivals for a woman's affection had unwittingly fueled each other's schemes, leading to a near tragedy. Here, too, jealousy and love had intertwined, creating a web of misunderstanding. As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes on the fading light outside. The Langley estate, with its secrets now laid bare, seemed less imposing, but the human frailties it housed were as old as time. She approached Clara and Edward, her voice gentle. "You've both been through a great ordeal. Trust will mend, in time, but it requires honesty. Mr. Langley, you must speak to Beatrice, understand her fears. And Miss Beaumont, your strength has carried you through. Hold fast to it." Edward nodded, his arm around Clara. "I will, Miss Marple. I need to see Beatrice, to understand why she felt so desperate. And Clara, she's my future now." Clara smiled, though her eyes were haunted. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You saw what we couldn't." Miss Marple returned to her cottage as dusk settled, the village quiet save for the distant hum of voices at the Blue Boar. She sat by her fire, Tuppence purring at her feet, and reviewed the day's revelations. Beatrice's jealousy, Roland's impulsive act, each had played a part in the mystery, but together they formed a coherent whole. The truth, like her knitting, had required patience to unravel, but the pattern was clear now. Yet a small doubt lingered, like a loose thread. Roland's story, though plausible, relied heavily on chance. Had he truly acted alone, or had he sensed Beatrice's plan and chosen to amplify it? Miss Marple set this thought aside, knowing that some questions might remain unanswered. "People are so predictable," she murmured to Tuppence, "and yet so full of surprises. Like a good novel, the ending satisfies, but the story never truly ends." The next day Beatrice would face the magistrate, her fate tempered by her remorse and the family's plea for leniency. Roland, his heart heavy, would return to London, his role in the drama concluded. And Clara and Edward, their love tested but intact, would plan a quieter wedding, one free of shadows. For Miss Marple, the case was a reminder of the delicate balance of human emotions, where love and fear could weave a tapestry both beautiful and tragic. Chapter 7. The Quiet Resolution. The morning sun bathed St. Mary's Mead in a gentle glow, as if the village itself sought to mend the wounds of the past week. Clara Beaumont's rescue from the Langley estate's cellar, Beatrice Langley's tearful confession, and Roland Hayes's reluctant admission had unravelled the mystery of the vanishing bride, revealing a tapestry woven from jealousy, love, and misguided devotion. The torn veil, the silver brooch, and the blue ribbon, once sinister clues, now lay exposed as the desperate handiwork of a sister unwilling to lose her brother. Yet for Miss Jane Marple, sipping tea in her cottage with her knitting untouched, the case felt like a skein of wool, with one final knot to untie. Human nature, she knew, was never quite as tidy as a solved puzzle, and the echoes of this drama would linger in the village's quiet lanes. The air was crisp as Miss Marple made her way to the church, where Clara and Edward had chosen to hold a subdued second attempt at their wedding. The grand floral displays of the first ceremony were gone, replaced by simple bouquets of daisies and lavender, a nod to resilience over ostentation. The pews held only a handful of guests, close family, the vicar, and a few loyal friends. Yet the atmosphere was warm, a stark contrast to the chaos of days past. Miss Marple slipped into her usual seat at the back, her sharp eyes noting the absence of Beatrice, who remained at the village station awaiting the magistrate's decision, and Roland, who had departed for London the previous evening. Clara, radiant in a cream silk gown, walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her smile steady despite the shadows in her eyes. Edward, waiting at the altar, stood tall, his face a mixture of joy and quiet resolve. As the vows were exchanged, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the human frailties that had nearly derailed this moment. Beatrice's fear, Roland's desperation, and the delicate balance of love that could so easily tip into obsession. She recalled a wedding in St. Mary's Mead years ago, disrupted by a jealous cousin's spite, and marvelled at how the patterns of human behaviour repeated, like stitches in a familiar pattern. After the ceremony, the small party gathered at the vicarage for a modest reception. Mrs. Langley, her composure restored, greeted guests with a fragile smile, her thoughts clearly with her daughter. Clara and Edward moved among the group, their hands entwined, their laughter a testament to their renewed bond. Miss Marple, sipping lemonade, was approached by Reverend Clements, whose kindly face bore traces of fatigue from the week's turmoil. "A happy ending, Miss Marple," he said, gesturing to the couple. "Thanks to your insight, we've Clara back and the truth laid bare. Though I confess I'm troubled for Beatrice. Such a sad business," Miss Marple nodded, her eyes on the newlyweds. "Sad indeed, Reverend." But Beatrice's actions, though wrong, came from love twisted by fear. She'll need time, and perhaps kindness, to find her way. The vicar sighed. The magistrate will decide her fate tomorrow. Edwards pleaded for leniency, and Mrs. Langley's written to a cousin in Bath, hoping Beatrice might stay there for a spell, to recover. "A wise choice," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "Distance can heal, and Beatrice must learn to loosen her hold on her brother. But I wonder, have we heard all there is to know about this affair?" Reverend Clements raised an eyebrow. "You think there's more?" Beatrice confessed, and Mr. Hayes explained his part. "What else could there be?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "In my experience, Reverend, people reveal only what they must. Mr. Hayes's story, for instance, his presence at the river, his tearing of the veil, it fits neatly, but it feels incomplete, like a scarf knitted too short." The vicar chuckled. "You see mysteries everywhere, Miss Marple. But surely this one is settled." "Perhaps," she replied, her eyes drifting to the window, where the village green stretched peaceful and green. "But human hearts are rarely so simple." Her curiosity unsatisfied, Miss Marple resolved to pay a final visit to the Blue Boar Inn, where Roland had spent his last hours in the village. Mrs. Hawkins, ever eager to share news, greeted her with a conspiratorial grin. "Miss Marple, you've missed the excitement." That Mr. Hayes left on the morning train, but not before a row with young Tommy Pierce. Seems Tommy saw him near the river again, night before last, poking about the brambles. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Did he now? And what did Mr. Hayes say to that? Said he was looking for something he'd dropped. A cigarette case, he claimed. But Tommy swears he was digging, like he was hiding something. Queer, isn't it? Very queer, Miss Marple agreed, her mind racing. Roland's explanation of the veil had been plausible, but this new detail suggested he had returned to the river after Clara's rescue, perhaps to cover another trace of his involvement. She thanked Mrs. Hawkins and made her way to the station, where the porter, a grizzled man named Mr. Dobbs, confirmed Roland's departure. "Aye, he was on the 7 o'clock to London," Mr. Dobbs said, scratching his chin. "Looked out of sorts, kept glancing over his shoulder. Had a small parcel with him, wrapped in brown paper. Didn't say what it was." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "A parcel, you say? How interesting. Did he speak to anyone before he left?" "Only the ticket clerk, and that was to buy his fare." kept to himself like he was in a hurry to be gone. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire. Tuppence curled at her feet and pieced together the fragments. Roland's second visit to the river, his mysterious parcel, his hasty departure. They suggested he had more to hide than a torn veil. She recalled a case from her youth, where a man had hidden incriminating letters in a hedgerow, only to retrieve them when suspicion turned elsewhere. Had Roland left something at the river, something he feared would betray him? Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple enlisted Tommy Pierce once more, meeting him in her garden with a promise of toffee. "Tommy," she said, her voice conspiratorial, "you're a sharp lad. Tell me exactly what you saw Mr. Hayes doing by the river." Tommy's eyes lit up. "I was coming back from fishing, ma'am, near midnight. Saw him by the old willow digging with a stick. He was muttering like he was cross. When he saw me, he shouted to clear off, said he'd lost his cigarette case. But he wasn't looking for something, he was burying it, I'd swear." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicion confirmed. "You've done well, Tommy. Now, one more task. Run to Constable Barnes and tell him to check the riverbank by the willow, near where the veil was found. There may be something buried there." Tommy scampered off, and Miss Marple settled back, her mind weaving the final threads. Roland's actions suggested guilt, but not of Beatrice's crime. Had he planted another clue, hoping to deepen the mystery, or had he hidden something personal, a memento of Clara he couldn't bear to keep? The answer came later that evening, when Constable Barnes arrived at her cottage, his face grim. "Miss Marple, you were right," he said, holding up a small, mud-stained bundle. "Found this buried under the willow. A locket, gold, with a picture of Miss Beaumont inside. There's an inscription, 'To Clara forever R.H.' Miss Marple examined the locket, its delicate chain tarnished but intact. Mr. Hayes's, no doubt. He must have buried it to rid himself of the past, or perhaps to avoid questions. A sentimental act, but a foolish one." The constable nodded. "I'll send word to London, have him questioned." "But it don't change Miss Langley's guilt, does it?" "No," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "Beatrice acted alone in her scheme, but Mr. Hayes's actions muddied the waters. He loved Clara, and love can make even a sensible man reckless." The next day, the magistrate granted Beatrice leniency. Swayed by her remorse and the family's pleas, she was to spend 6 months under supervision in Bath, with her cousin, a decision that brought Mrs. Langley to tears of gratitude. Clara and Edward, now married, began to rebuild their trust, their love strengthened by adversity. Roland, contacted in London, admitted to burying the locket, a final gesture of farewell to a love he could not reclaim. He faced no charges, his actions deemed foolish, but not criminal. Miss Marple, back in her cottage, resumed her knitting, the familiar rhythm soothing her restless mind. "People are so like my wool," she said to Tuppence, who blinked lazily. "Tangled, knotted, but with care, the pattern emerges. And yet there's always a loose thread, a reminder that no story is ever fully told." The village settled into its quiet rhythm, the scandal of the vanishing bride fading into law. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing, her mind already alert for the next ripple in St. Mary's Mead's tranquil surface, where human nature, with all its flaws and passions, waited to weave another tale.